Are you ready to dive into some history, some mystery, maybe with a dash of wholesome philosophy? We're going to be learning about the actual, true, documented history of the very early era of Freemasonry, before they were even called Freemasons, as a matter of fact. And this is all true, and it's about to appear on this episode of Further Light. Step into a place where knowledge meets the extraordinary as we embark on an unforgettable voyage through the realms of mystery, myths, and the enigmatic unknown. Welcome to Further Light, the illuminating series that brings you closer to the secrets that most intrigue you. Join us as we delve into the depths of untold stories, guided by esteemed experts and captivating storytellers. Further Light invites you to journey on a quest for enlightenment that will challenge your perceptions and expand your understanding of the world around us. The opinions expressed on this show are those of the individual and do not represent Grand Lodge or any other Masonic body. Jim, to start, actually, just tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get interested in Masonic history? What really propelled you into doing the research that you're going to be talking with us today about?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me, and I really appreciate the fact that I'm able to present this to Freemasons, because I think it's important. I've spent about 9 years coming up with this theory, and as you know, there's always been a missing link between the Knights Templar and the Freemasons. There were a lot of connections, peripheral, you might say, but there was never that final link. And how I got involved in this, actually, I was studying the history of Nova Scotia, because my distant relative right now is the Knight Baronet of Nova Scotia. And we've held that title since 1625. He's the premier Knight Baronet. And so I wanted to know more about what that was all about. And I just kept digging and digging, and it's a nice little hobby. I'm retired now, and it's a nice little hobby. And you go down what we call rabbit holes, and oh my gosh, this connects to that, and that connects to this. And pretty soon I realized, oh my gosh, I think I have that missing link between the Templars and the Freemasons, and it's pretty legitimate. So that's kind of where I started, and it's kind of hard to stop. I mean, like I say, I've been retired 11 years and spent 9 of them working on this, and truthfully, almost every day, but I'm thinking about it every day if I'm not working on it every day.
So very briefly describe what you're going to be talking to us about today. The beginning year, the end year, the groups involved, just so that people can initially get a bearing, set themselves in the place that we're about to talk about.
Okay. Well, there's basically 4 groups involved, and the first 2 were in the Holy Land, starting about the 1100s. They were dissolved, or their lives changed, let's put it that way, in 1312. But they continued in unison to a large degree all the way until the 1500s, when they were dissolved totally in Scotland. And it was a big deal because all the possessions they had, all the lands, there were 640 pieces of property. In today's money, again, we're talking millions of dollars. And then the people that were involved in that, 4 of the main people involved in that transaction became what later became known as Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. And it was a knighthood created just to raise money, particularly, and people for Nova Scotia. And then when that closed down in 32, in 1633, they fought a big court case trying to get their land back. By 1634, the first recorded Freemasons are accepted, and they are the 2 of the sons and the partner of the proprietor of Nova Scotia. And their records still exist at Edinburgh Lodge Number 1, what they call Mary's Chapel, and they're the original handwriting. And so it's an obvious connection that the missing link all along was the Knights Baronet. And I don't know if you're familiar with the book, The History of the Knights Templar by James Burns, but he was a Mason, and he wrote this book to the Grand Master of the English Masons. And he was so close. We didn't realize how close he was. He talked about the turnover of the possessions to actually to Mary Queen of Scots, but in reality it was to the Protestant Parliament of Scotland. And then he picked up with Freemasonry, but he missed that one step that was in the middle. And
well,
the only reason I was able
to... I was going to say, let's start at the beginning for those who maybe are less familiar with the Knights Templar. Now, they've probably seen it in TV shows and movies, anywhere from Indiana Jones to, I don't know what else they were in. Oh, National Treasure. The Knights Templar, they were an actual organization. As you mentioned, they started in more than 1,000 years ago, right? Yeah, more than 1,000 years ago. What was their purpose? Were they involved with the Crusades? I don't remember. Can't remember what they.
Yes, they were. There were people going there, knights going there to protect the Holy Land, so Christian pilgrims could go there and see the sights and all that. And they were a lot of times getting attacked. So the original purpose of the Templars was simply to protect the pathways of the pilgrimage, just to make sure they could get there safely. And the reason why they were called the Templars is because they were the poor sons of the elites out of Great Britain and France. And they call it promulgature, where the oldest son got all the property. So that left the other sons poor, and the poorest was the last son down. So the two gentlemen that started it were the poor sons, and they went down to the Holy Land, and one of their fathers or somebody paved the way so that they could stay. They had to have lodging so that they could stay at the Temple of Solomon. So they called themselves the Order of the Temple, which eventually became the Templars, the Order of the Templars. And so that was their original purpose, which was to protect the routes, pilgrimage routes. And then the other group that we're going to talk about, they're known by a lot of names. They're essentially the Knights of St. John, but they were called the Hospitallers because their goal was to create hospitals and provide medical care for the people that were there. Well, as things worsened in the Holy Land, they both became military orders, and they fought together at a lot of battles. The Hospitallers were actually formed first, and then the Templars came along. And so they became more known for their military exploits, but they still carried on their other mission. And in fact, they were both together at the Battle of Acre, which it's spelt like the word acre, but it's Acre, on the coast of the Mediterranean. And that's when the Muslim groups, now they were not against Muslims. They, in their order, rules of the order, they were not against anybody that believed in God and treated people decently. And this James Burns I mentioned before, one of the reasons I think he missed the boat on it was because he wrote that book, by the way, in 1840, was that he contended that they could not be connected, the Templars and the Freemasons, because Freemasons will accept anybody of any faith as long as they have a belief in some type of God. Well, that was actually one of the tenets of the Knights Templar. They were not accepted as Templars, but they were accepted. They have a separate order called the Knights of Saladin, but they were a brother organization to the Templars, and they worked together because not every Muslim in the Holy Land wanted to fight against every Christian. It was just certain groups. And so all the way up through, there's been many records of Muslims that had held high positions in the British Isles, and I'm not talking recently, I'm talking in the past, and also Jewish people, Jewish men that moved up there. They can trace their families back. So it was...
the Knights Templar eventually got into trouble with the Pope, right? Or some...
Yes, well, they were...
I'm just wondering if that was the reason why they got in trouble, because they were friendly to other religions.
Well, it could have been, and also their legend is that they found some substantial treasures in the Temple of Solomon, and the legend is that treasures were spirited out of Accra the day before the big battle by 10 Templars, and one of those gentlemen became the next Grand Master, because the current Grand Master of that day died that day, and so somebody else had to take over. So they moved back to France, and they started building tenement buildings and churches, chapels, whatever. And this is one of the crazy things about it, is that the Templars and the stonemasons were connected for hundreds and hundreds of years. All through Europe, there were supposed to be about 9,000 Templar properties, and virtually all of those properties had either tenement buildings or chapels, libraries on them, even law schools. And in Scotland, they had 640 that they've been able to actually trace through the documents. So they became powerful because they were the world's first bankers. They created the first traveler checks and all this. And King Philip of France had borrowed a lot of money from them. And so he was in a position where he knew he couldn't pay it back. He knew they weren't interested in lending him anymore. And so his only solution was he would dissolve the Templars and take all their treasure. So he talked the Pope into it. It was Pope Clement V. He was very reluctant, very, very reluctant to do this. But the French attacked the Templars, captured many of them. Some got away. And the Pope continued to argue for the Templars being good people. They started having trials, and there are documents by the Pope saying, well, I don't really think they did that much wrong. If they just say they're part of the church and whatever, I don't have any problem accepting it. But Philip kind of owned Pope Clement, and so he won the day. So in 1312 is our very key date for two things to happen. Number one, and if you want to put up the slide, the first slide that I sent you, we can talk to this. On the left is it's a document called Vox in Excelso, and it was that is a copy of the original papal bull. So this is when I say I use primary source documents. Can't get any more primary source than that. And that is when Pope Clement outlawed the Templars. And he did it by putting them into perpetual prohibition, which is the name of my book that tells this whole story in detail, Perpetual Prohibition. And they were not allowed to wear there it is right there. Yeah. And they were not allowed to wear the habit. They were not allowed to call themselves Templars, attend any events, any church thing as a Templar. Well, that posed a problem because they owned so much material, so many possessions, land, all this stuff. So he got the idea, well, I'll just turn it all over to the Knights Hospitaller, they eventually became the Knights of Malta. They've had a few names, but they were the Knights of St. John or the Hospitallers. And so he turned all their possessions over to this group in the same year. And that papal bull is called Ad Providem.
So,
So those two,
roughly what year is this?
this is 1312. And that was a big turning point. It was a turning point for the Templars that they could no longer exist, but it was a turning point for the Knights of St. John because now they inherited all these possessions. And the one thing about it is it didn't happen in 1312. There was bookwork to do and clearing deeds and actually a lot of upset Templars. So it took a century or more. There were still deeds that were under the veil of the Knights Hospitaller, but they said in the deed it was Templar property. So it was a long, long process to do this. And in some cases, and particularly in Scotland, the Grand Master of the Knights of St. John, or the Hospitallers, was also the Grand Master of whatever was left over from the Knights Templar. And in the case of Scotland, it was a man named James Sandylance. So just before this trade-off happened with Mary Queen of Scots, she had come back from France and she was under a lot of pressure from a Protestant parliament. But the whole takeover of the Scottish government by the Protestants hadn't happened yet. And the parliament did not like the fact that stonemasons were having secret meetings. They didn't want anybody to have a secret meeting. Well, the stonemasons had their reasons for it. There was a lot of money in building these cathedrals, and there was a lot of skill. And if you got a shoddy workman in, he could make the whole thing fall apart or give you a bad name or whatever.
Just so that it's clear, Jim, just so that it's clear to everybody that's listening, when you say stonemasons, you're actually talking about the tradesmen. It wasn't
the people who built the
right
churches. And they had names for these people that would, today a union would call them scabs, and they were always on the lookout for them. And they had the secret handshake and secret words, and the purpose of that was because originally there weren't lodges like you think of now. The lodge was actually something they built temporarily at a site where they were building a big church. They had to stay somewhere, and rather than I don't even know if they had hotels or whatever, but rather than impose on people, they would build somewhat of a makeshift lodge where they would stay until the church was built. Then another church would be built 100 miles away. They decided, well, we'll move there, or pick everything up and just move there and work on that church for a while. And some churches took 2 or 3 years to build. They were gigantic cathedrals, beautiful cathedrals. So that's where the word lodge came from. But in 1555 is when Parliament outlawed secret stonemason meetings. Well, the stonemasons were very upset because they were afraid that their secrets were going to get out to everyone. They didn't want that to happen. And the very next year, Mary Queen of Scots reinstated their right to have secret stonemason meetings. And if you put the next slide up, it shows the actual document. This document was only found in 2019. It was known about, but it was found in a royal residence called Holyrood amongst a lot of other papers, and they were translating it and realized what they had in their hand. And this is the actual document that gave stonemasons in Scotland the right to start meeting in secret again. So from 56 to 63, that's when there was a lot more pressure from Parliament. And Mary Queen of Scots was losing her grip on Scotland. And so in 63, this James Sandylance, he was called Lord Torphichen. It looks like Torphichen, but it's actually pronounced Torphichen. He was the Grand Master of both the Hospitallers and the Knights Templar. And Elias Ashmole, who we mentioned earlier, he actually writes, a charter was granted to Lord Torphichen the representative in Scotland of the ancient Knights Templar. And also the very record of this transfer of the possessions to Mary Queen of Scots, which ultimately was to Parliament, not to her, but because she was the figurehead, she signed off on it. But the record was written March 24th of 1563. And on the right-hand side, you'll see here that Lord Torpichin actually brought that to Parliament, brought the actual document to Parliament to show them it in 1871. But this other record was made of it, and it says, the present possessor of the lordship and preceptory of Torficon, which was never subject to any charter of covenant whatsoever, except only the Knights of Jerusalem and Temple of Solomon. In other words, they owed no loyalty to anybody except the Templars and the Knights of St. John. But James Sandilands was a friend of John Knox, who was leading the Presbyterian movement, and he became a Presbyterian, even though he had become a Grand Master of the Knights of Malta by going to Malta, and that was sponsored by the Catholic Church. For some reason, he decided to jump ship, so he made this deal with Mary Queen of Scots. I will give you all the possessions, which meant principally all the land. And some of the ones that he gave were the legendary ones of the Templars. But I will give you all the lands and possessions of the Templars and the Knights of St. John. You give me back these three principal estates, which were, pretty prominent estates, and you make me Lord Torpichin and my heirs, Lord Torficon, forever, and we have a deal. So, of course, again, I don't think she had a lot of say in it. I think she was the figurehead, but she said yes. So there were 5 men involved in the transaction. Torficon and 4 other men. One of those men turned out to be a spy and was executed. But of the other 4, all of them had heirs who eventually became Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. And between 63, when all that was dissolved, and again, it took time to get transfer of land titles and all that. It wasn't just it didn't happen the very next day, but it was happening. Mary Queen of Scots was beheaded by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, and Queen Elizabeth didn't have any children, so Mary's only son, James VI of Scotland, was chosen to be James I of Great Britain. So he actually followed Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was in favor of him because he had turned to the Protestant religion too. He didn't have much choice either because he was surrounded by Protestant barons, so he didn't have much choice either. But it doesn't seem like it was neither here nor there to him. He wasn't strong in one faith or the other. He just wanted to be the king. And he became the king of Great Britain in 1603. And William Alexander, who he was born about the time of that trade-off of Lord Torficon. He was born about that year, or a little after that. He lived on former Templar land. There's 2 documents in Scotland about that. So he would have known all that history, and he was the tutor for King James, the sons of King James. So he was one of the things he's teaching them was the history of Scotland and the history of the world. And so he would have been well versed in it. He was quite the poet. He wrote, some people compare him to Shakespeare. In fact, there are some people that think he wrote at least some of the Shakespeare plays. But regardless, he saw this opportunity to take this land that would become Nova Scotia to create a buffer between the French and French Canada, which basically was only Quebec at the time, and New England, so that the New England people wouldn't get surprised one day with a bunch of French soldiers coming down. And he was originally asked just to send them there, more or less as mercenaries. But he said, well, if you got a new France and a New England and a new Spain, give me it as New Scotland and I'll do it. So they did. So King James gave it to him. But he was having trouble getting people to go and raising money. So what you see here on the right, that is the medal that the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia were allowed to wear, and they were founded in 1625. The map that you see here is drawn in 1624. Nobody knows who drew it, but King Charles, who followed his father James as king, he specifically says that William Alexander traveled to and surveyed Nova Scotia. So you wonder why he would say that if it wasn't true. And William Alexander made the comment, I remember nothing with more fondness than I do Nova Scotia. So that sounds like he was there too. But the circle in the left there, that is a title of the Earl of Arundel. And this guy factors into this in an amazing way. His name was Thomas Howard. He lived right down the road from William Alexander in London, about 7 miles difference. Sir Francis Bacon died at his home. And he had lived in that area earlier. And he and Francis Bacon had gone to Scotland to set up a permanent lodge, the first permanent lodge for Masons, and they chose a chapel. It was called Mary's Chapel. It was built for the Virgin Mary, but it was built by the widow of from my family, one of the members of my family, and the man had passed away, the Lord of the Isles. I descend from his brother. And the king gave her that land as sort of a gift to a widow, and she built the chapel there. Well, down the road after the Reformation, the chapel wasn't being used for anything religious anymore. And so Francis Bacon and Thomas Howard and two other men went up there, looked around, found this place, bought it. They bought it in November, and the first Masonic meeting was held there towards the end of November. Now, other guilds also met there, principally carpenters. They called them Wrights, W-R-I-G-H-T-S. So originally it was the Masons and the Wrights that met there, but eventually a lot of guilds met there because it was a nice building. It was right downtown Edinburgh, and it had been a chapel. And
Again, to clarify, when we talk about Masons, we're talking about the trade guild, not
right,
anything else.
right.
Just so that everyone knows out there in TV land that's where we're really just talking about workers.
Right. And the Wrights also kept their, all the guilds kept their skills and secrets private because, again, the two things they didn't want is for somebody to take their work away from them, but the other was they didn't want shoddy workmanship that would reflect on them. So that was their two driving forces. So now we have a stonemason's lodge, not a Freemason's lodge, in Edinburgh, in a specific building. There are two drawings of that building, so we have a good idea what it looks like, and there's descriptions of where it was located on the street. So it's gone now because they used that area for a bridge, but you can actually go almost to exactly where this first lodge was. But how the Knights Baronet are involved, that again, William Alexander had to get people together and money together. And in 1622, he sent a ship and it never made it there. And it costs a lot of money to send a ship. It came back. He needed to get money together for a second one. And a gentleman named Alexander Strachan, he also signed his name as Al Strachan. And so I refer to him as Al Strachan. Sometimes the name is said Strawn. Even within the family, there's that variety of it. But I always say Strachan. He stole what was considered the greatest treasure in Scotland at the time. It belonged to the Earl Marshal of Scotland. And he was the man that would confiscate leftover items when somebody passed away or when the laws were broken. And he had amassed an incredible treasure of gold coins and silver coins and diamonds, and it's a long, long list. So Strachan spearheaded this robbery, but he had co-conspirators, and one of them, at least one, was a son of this George Keith, the Earl Marshal. Another one perhaps was involved because he later became a knight baronet on the same day as Al Strachan. And then there was a William Douglas that was involved, and even George Keith's wife was involved, and she ended up marrying Al Strachan. Well, they were all put under indictment after the robbery, and this George Keith passed away shortly after the robbery. They were all put under indictment. So now you have all this money, and it's been estimated to be as much as $1 to $4 billion based on, and another gentleman worked on it that I didn't even know, but I found his work on it. I had come up with about 1 billion. He came up with 3 to 4 billion. And it's very hard to do because, again, you're trying to judge the worth of a diamond in 1622 to what that diamond would be worth today, or even a pound, an English pound or a Scottish pound. So you just do your best to come up with it, but it's definitely in the hundreds of millions. Well, nobody knows where it went because I am I'm a fellow with the Society of Antiquaries in Scotland. And I asked them, and I asked the Scottish National Museums, I asked the Scottish National Records, does anybody know what happened to it? Nobody did. I found the court record, and in that court record, most of the people just seem to be let off scot-free, but the one son is tried separately, and he is told to bring all the possessions to the king, which he never showed up in the court case, and he never took the possessions there. But, so two things happened. One of two things happened. They were elite people that did the robbery. They just weren't fly-by-nights. They got caught, and the king, and maybe through William Alexander, the king said, we'll let you go free if you give us some of that money for Nova Scotia, and possibly even just for Great Britain, because they were both crying poor at the time. Or they were both in on it too. But the king, William Alexander, and these people all conspired to rob that man because he had more wealth in Scotland than anybody. He had 33 castles. It was said that he could sleep at home no matter where he was in Scotland. 33 castles. One of the items in a long, long list was 28,000 pounds in worth of gold and silver. Another one was a green coffer, or treasure chest as we'd call it, worth of I believe it was 13 or 16,000. I have to go check that, pounds in additional coins and silver and gold coins. And so all of that went somewhere, and that was major money for a king that was crying poor. And Alexander spent his fortune on getting those first two ships to go to Nova Scotia. He was crying poor too. So in January of 1625, the king pardoned everyone, just a blanket pardon. And then by May, Al Strachan, the main conspirator, William Keith, who was the son of the man that was robbed, and another gentleman, Robert Gordon, who was kind of like the henchman for the king, they became the first Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. So you have the man whose inheritance was robbed and the man who robbed it sitting in the same room becoming knights together for Nova Scotia. And things were tough in all of those old countries by then. A lot of the natural resources were used up: gold, silver, timber, game animals, all of that. And William Alexander had even made the comment once that we are now resorting to fighting or fishing just to stay alive, because fishing was big and it replenished itself, although you could only take so much fish. But so it was obvious, and it was the same way in France and other places too. They just expended their resources. But they saw Nova Scotia. It didn't take long to find out Nova Scotia was full of lumber, full of fish, full of beaver and beaver pelts, which turned out to be a dramatically large business, and even the hope of gold and silver. And we do think some of that was mined there long before it was ever recorded as being mined. And so that enticed these people to go. They're like, okay, well, now I'll buy my knighthood. I'll have a knighthood. One of the things you got with a knighthood is all your past crimes were absolved, and the only person in the world you answered to was William Alexander. So if you're like some Scotsman up in, because the clans fought a lot. Once the resources started dying away, it was kind of like everybody wanted a slice of the same pie. So there were many clan battles. I mean, that's just part of Scottish history. So you know that there were many crimes created along the way, and now you're being told you could have 16,000 acres in Nova Scotia, and any crimes you committed, they're all pardoned, and the only person you gotta ever talk to is William Alexander. It was enticing for a lot of people, and originally it was going to be 100, and they were going to build 100 estates around the shoreline of Nova Scotia. They turned out to be in lots, in almost like in developments, you might say, which probably was for safety. And but it was expanded then to 150. But in researching it, it only appears that about 122 ever signed up. But even today, just like the Templars continued and the Knights of Malta continued, the Knights of Baronet have continued, and there are 115 heirs to those titles. And they have fought to get their land back from Nova Scotia for centuries, a lot of court cases, but they've just never been able to do it. So they got there solidly in 1629, and they created a fort called Charles Fort after King Charles over on the other side of Nova Scotia, the leeward side where there wasn't so much wind. And in 1632, King Charles made a deal with the King of France that he would give Nova Scotia back for a certain amount of money. And again, he was just as poor as his dad because they just spent money like crazy on their things in the castle and horses and whatever that kings like to spend money on. And so he undercut William Alexander. And so a lot of people will say William Alexander failed in Nova Scotia. He didn't fail at all. He had up to 2,000 people there. There's evidence of 2,000 people there. They always say there were only 70, which were the original 70 sent, but there are records of 2,000. And several ships were sent. I counted up between 14 and 17 ships that went over there, sent by William Alexander. Each one of those ships had hundreds of people on them, and they were all bringing more settlers. So it was going hunky-dory until King Charles decided to give it back to the King of France. So they got their marching orders in 1632 of April, well, March actually, but they had to leave in 8 weeks. So that would have put them on the North Atlantic in April when there was a lot of storms. So I believe they laid over there in a place called Mahone Bay, and then there's a shipwreck there that has artifacts on it that connect to the story, but they left 50 men behind, and the rest of them all went home. And these 50 men went cross country back up to Port Royal. Well, the French sent a Knight of Malta named Isaac de Razilly there to lead the French troops to get those last 50 men. In the end, 40 some of them went back, agreed to go back. The rest wanted to stay there because they had married into the indigenous tribes, whatever, or even into the French communities there. By the end of 1632, by December of 1632, for all intents and purposes, this William Alexander's settlement ended. So in 1633, the Knights Baronet, they were very mad at him. They were very mad at the king. And they filed a big lawsuit to get their land back. And it failed because there was no way they could do it now. The French had total control under the Knights of Malta leadership. So by 1634, in the meantime, the Alexanders had to make money somehow, because now this whole American dream, literally the American dream for them, had failed, not because of them. And so William Alexander got his son Anthony named as the Master of Works, which basically be the Master of Public Works. And they would build the bridges and the cathedrals and repair the castles, all that kind of work. And actually, they were fought tooth and nail by William Sinclair from Roslyn. And he pulled every trick he could, and William Alexander pulled every trick he could, until finally Anthony was named in that position. But the biggest complaint about him was he had no skills. He had studied architecture in Europe for 3 years, but he had no physical skills, particularly stonemasonry. And one of the people he'd be in charge of were the stonemasons. So William Sinclair, that was his big beef with it, is that how can you put somebody that's never even cut a stone in their life in charge of the stonemasons? But Alexander was very powerful with the king, and he did. And on July 3rd, 1634, the first minutes were written for the first 3 known provable Freemasons. They didn't call them Freemasons that day. They called them Freemen Masons. And they were William Alexander Jr., who had led the Scots in Nova Scotia, Anthony Alexander, who was the Master of Public Works, and Al Strachan, the man that had the big treasure. Strachan had also been named to the King's Privy Council, and he also became a Knight Baronet. So he went from the scoundrel to quite the elite. And so those were the first three Freemasons. And I believe I sent you a slide that shows one of the minutes. Well, actually, I can talk about this first since it's on the screen. I mentioned Thomas Howard being on that map and how he was friends with William Alexander. Well, he would have been the Grand Master of stonemasons on the day that those men were initiated. Those non-stonemasons, non-operative stonemasons were initiated. And after he died in 1646, this woodcut was made to commemorate him. And I happened to notice that there were Masonic symbols all over the place. Compass, square, the 2-foot rule, the hourglass, the plum, the pyramid. So they were celebrating the fact that he had led the stonemasons for so long. And again, he was a neighbor to William Alexander in London, and he knew Sir Francis Bacon, who died at his home. And the first lodge in England, the first meeting to talk about the Grand Lodge, took place in a pub in between the houses of Howard and Alexander. And the one thing about Howard was Elias Ashmole, who's a pretty famous Freemason. He entered the craft in that same year. Howard had a tremendous collection of inscribed stones from all over the world, and Ashmole took that to Oxford, and he created the first modern museum called the Ashmolean Museum. It's still there, and Thomas Howard's inscribed stones are still there. They have a beautiful display of them there. So he knew Thomas Howard very well. And when he was initiated, he said specifically that he was a Freemason, spelt the modern way, F-R-E-E. Well, what you see on the screen right now, this is the initiation of Al Strachan. Now, it was portrayed as the initiation of William Alexander Jr. as the first minute, But in looking it over, I could see it wasn't, because for the simple reason that both William Alexander Jr. and Anthony Alexander signed it, and L. Strachan signed it. Well, L. Strachan wouldn't be able to sign it as a Freemason if he'd never been accepted yet. And if the two before it, they only mentioned William Alexander Jr. The second one, they mentioned Anthony, but William Alexander Jr. signed it. And by the third one, all three of them signed it. So this has to be the minute for L. Strachan. And this still exists in Edinburgh at Lodge Number 1, Mary's Chapel. Now, they don't use that chapel anymore. They moved to a much nicer place. But so this is, again, a primary source document. It was written on July 3rd, 1634. There is no document before this that actually refers to any man being made a non-operative Mason. Now, there's a couple of sketchy ones, but I guess you could say I debunked them in my book because there's not enough proof that they're real. And there was no reason for them. But in this case, there was a reason, because Anthony Alexander was the master of public works. So the glory days didn't last too long, because Anthony died not too long after he was initiated, and then his brother died 9 months later. Now, a third brother became the seventh Freemason, and he stayed in there till 1639, and then he moved down to London to his dad's home. And probably why is because his grandfather died that year. And so he probably wanted to go down there. His father died the very next year. But, and he was the last Alexander leader of the Edinburgh Lodge. He was made the leader at one point there and left. So at that point, as of 1639, essentially any leadership by the Alexander family was done for the Edinburgh Lodge. In 1640, Alexander Hamilton, and not the one from the United States, of course, although he could have been related, who knows, but he became a Freemason, and we have the minutes for that on the next slide. And that was 1640, and then below that is for Robert Moray, one of the more famous early Freemasons and the founder of the Royal Society, and he was in 1641. So you can see that there was a continuous pattern. Started in 34, they had some in 35, 36, 37, up to 39. Then there was, and then actually it kind of, the attention pulled away a little bit from Edinburgh because Hamilton and Moray were actually entered in England as they were part of the military by then. And the main warden was named John Milne. This is a shot of one of them. There were two, a father and a son, and one followed the other. But they were also the master mason for the king. And so they were not a Freemason per se, because they were an actual stonemason. But they're signed on all of these. They're signed on Moray's, on Hamilton's, on William Jr.'s, on Anthony's, and on L. Strachan's. The same one or the other of these two gentlemen are signed on all 5 of those. So it was a continuous episode here, and by 1646, that's when Elias Ashmole joined. Now, other people were joining, but there wasn't a solid record made of them, but other people were joining in this group. And so Elias Ashmole started recording the history. I mean, I think he was thinking, well, this is all pretty embryonic. This is 46 and it just happened in 34. It's only 12 years ago. So somebody should probably start writing this down. So he was one of the earliest historians of the Freemasons. And so it continued on through by 1717 in England, the Grand Lodge of England was created, but you can't have a Grand Lodge unless you have a bunch of other lodges. And in this case, 4 lodges joined together to create the Grand Lodge, but other lodges refused to do it. So there were, at least we know, more than just 4 lodges already that had, who knows how long they had been in existence. And they were right in the neighborhood. All of this was right in the neighborhood of where the Alexander home had been, where William lived and where his son William lived for a while. And even his daughters lived, or one of his daughters anyway is listed down the road as living there. And the Thomas Howard home, his son inherited that when he passed away, etc. So the center of Freemasonry kind of moved from Edinburgh down to the Grand Lodge of England in 1717. And then in Scotland, it was created in 1736, the Grand Lodge of Scotland. Now, here's an interesting statistic. There have been 110 Grand Masters of the Scottish Lodge. 90 of them are easily recognizable as Knights Baronet families. 90 of them. It's 80-some percent, 83%, I think. And that's only because through the paternal line. If you went in and judged all these others that remain, these other 20 that remained, undoubtedly you're going to find a maternal line for those people. And this extends all the way down to today. The Grandmaster today, it's kind of a fluke situation because he was Grandmaster until 2023, and another gentleman took over, and for some reason he abruptly left, and so they asked this other gentleman to come back. So the current Grandmaster's name is William McGee, but his middle name or his nickname is Ramsay because his mother was a Ramsay, and the Ramsays have permeated Scottish Freemasonry right from the beginning. The 5th Freemason was David Ramsay. If you go back and look at the records, you'll see how many Ramsays were Grandmasters or held other important positions. So the Knights Baronet not only permeated Scottish Freemasonry, but several Grand Masters of England were also Knights Baronet families. In a few cases, the same gentleman was the Grand Master of the Scottish Grand Lodge and of the English Grand Lodge. So there's no way that you can separate the Knights Baronet from the history of the Freemasons. And the same families that were involved in the final dissolution, I guess you'd say, of the Knights Templar and Knights of St. John became Knights Baronet. So now you can't separate that either. And it is so tight that James Sandilands, who I mentioned earlier, his heir down the road a little bit, his name was Walter. He was still Lord Torpichen. He still owned all these old Templar properties. He married the granddaughter of William Alexander. She was the daughter specifically of William Alexander Jr., the world's first known Freemason. So the man who inherited the Lord Torpichen title, which was the Templars and the Knights Hospitaller, married the daughter of the first known or recorded Freemason. So again, you just can't separate these. And when we had done a couple years ago, we did a giant storyboard, giant, like 30-foot long, and we were just using little Post-it notes. And we found that so many of these men that were involved in these organizations, they were involved in 2 or 3 of the organizations. Howard, for instance, he had ancestors that were Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller or Knights of St. John. Alexander was born and raised on Templar property, and so was the first 2 Freemasons, William Jr. and Anthony. So it's a tight-knit group. We like to refer to it as a multi-generational conspiracy of elites. They were trying to get out of Dodge, make a better life for themselves in America. When that didn't pan out because of King Charles' move, they went underground into the stonemason lodges and decided they were going to try to make life better through a group called the Freemasons. And so that's what I've discovered, and I have lots of documents. I think we covered all the slides there, maybe.
Yes, we did. I just want to remind everybody that Jim wrote a book that describes this in detail. If you'd really like to keep this story in your own literary collection, definitely you can pick up this book and learn all about it. It's a very fascinating story. And Jim, I want to thank you for taking the time to really go into this and provide a level of detail that a lot of people, quite frankly, aren't aware of. But it really shows how this evolved from things that we really know are there, even something as well known as the Knights Templar that most people have heard
Well,
of.
I'll tell you just a couple quick anecdotes, so we can keep the time short here. But I gave a talk to a local lodge, and just before I was going to talk, elderly gentleman came up to me and he said, "I've been studying this for 40 years, and there's no connection to of the Knights Templar to the Freemasons." And I said, "Well, I'm just here. I'm not here to argue that. I'm just here to tell you what I found out. You can make your own judgment." So after I was done, all these nice Freemasons were coming up and talking to me. They were showing me their charter and all these old things they had, and they were buying one of my books at the time. I can't remember which one it was at the time. And he was kind of standing back. And so I thought, well, what's he going to do? Come up and tell me I was full of baloney? And he came up and he says, "My God, I've been studying this for 40 years, and I think you finally figured it out," which just made me feel so good. So in 2023, I was approached by a research lodge down, it's just below Cincinnati, but into Kentucky. 55 Masonic historians from 5 different states met there to hear me talk, and they grilled me. We went out the night before to dinner, and they grilled me at the dinner, and then I gave my presentation, and it was well received. And so if you look at the evidence, the book is called Perpetual Prohibition, because that's what the Pope had said about outlawing the Templars, and it's on Amazon, by the way. But it strings these 4 groups together using a lot of primary source documents, some of which you've shown on the screen. And I don't think that it's ever been done that way before. And again, I'm open to more discovery. I'm not stuck in my ways, but I haven't found anything that takes me off my path. So I really appreciate you allowing me to share this, and I hope that the people that watch it, whether they buy my book or not, I hope they've enjoyed hearing about this connection, because it may be the missing link.
Well, thanks again, Jim. Thanks for taking the time. I know that we've ran a little bit longer than normal, but it was fascinating. I really, and I think